In debates, ladies and gentlemen, it's always preferable to have the last word, but I don't mind dipping my toe into the water first to look at the challenges facing this election for all political parties, and most particularly my own. I've got 20 minutes. I will make 5 key points, that is roughly 4 minutes each, but I will steal one of those minutes to say thank you very much to the Daily Maverick for organizing these debates and enabling us to use the opportunity to make the issues the issue, which has been happening all too little, I think, in this election campaign, and it is often difficult to get the issues through the rhetoric of the campaign. I usually find it very useful when I'm making big decisions in the present to project myself into the future and to look back from that vantage point and to say to myself, what should have been the decisions that we were making back then? And that applies equally to an election campaign. Projecting ourselves 5-10 years into the future, we have to ask ourselves now, looking back from that vantage point, what should this election have been about? And therefore, what should we be doing now to make sure it is about those things? And that is what my talk will be about today. Firstly, I think when we look back in 5 to 10 years, we will see that this election was catalytic in the realignment of politics. Now, what do I mean by that? Realignment is the complex and difficult process of getting all the people who share the same core values and vision for South Africa into the same political movement to build a new majority, preferably by 2019. That needs to be the aim of all people committed to realignment in politics, and it is certainly the DA's aim. We believe that the political boundaries dividing political parties are obsolete, that many people in many different parties share the same value and vision, and that many of the racial barriers of the past are making it difficult for all of us to come together and build a new majority. And we believe that has to happen around 4 key principles. The first is constitutionalism and the rule of law, obviously curbs on the exercise of power, which is central to any democracy. Secondly, an open market economy as the basis for successful strategies to beat poverty, to create jobs, and to include everybody in the economy, with the state playing a facilitative role rather than a controlling role in the process. The third principle is non-racialism and how we approach redress. Are we going to approach redress to deal with the dreadful legacy of apartheid in a way that overcomes racial divisions or in a way that permanently entrenches them? And the fourth principle is the separation of party and state, which should be subsumed under the first, which is constitutionalism, but because it is so critical to our country and because the erosion of that separation is undermining so much of what we're trying to build in this country, we have to hold it up as a key principle on its own. And of course, we know that those are the core insights of the National Development Plan. And they're the core insights of many individuals in many parties, if you look at the manifestos of the different parties. And interestingly enough, the dividing line between the people who are trying to promote those principles and those who oppose them in many ways actually runs right through the middle of the ANC. So the realignment of politics is going to involve the disintegration of the ANC as we currently know it, and the reconstitution of a new majority at the non-racial center of South African politics. And if that happens by 2019, we will have saved our constitution and our democracy and be on a very good platform to grow our economy and to create jobs and to include everybody in a meaningful economy for the future. And so that is our goal. And when we look back at the 2014 election, we will see how critical this election was as a step towards achieving that goal. The next critical point is, when we look back on the 2014 election, will we have made enough headway in the race against time to save our constitution from erosion? What we've learned in the last 20 years of our democracy is that constitutionalism is very, very vulnerable. You don't need a 2/3 majority to change the constitution. you can actually undermine it without changing a word of it, by deploying cadres to institutions that are supposed to be independent of the ruling clique, of the ruling party. And we've seen how the ANC has changed in respect of the Constitution. Mandela championed the Constitution and defended it. Mbeki certainly did to a very significant extent, not nearly as much as Mandela, but certainly to a significant extent. And we believe that President Zuma does not. In fact, we think that his fundamental misunderstanding is about what constitutionalism is, really symbolized by his statement, "Who do the judges think they are? They weren't elected, we were," or words to that effect. And so a fundamental misunderstanding of constitutionalism defines the Zuma presidency, as we've seen not only in that kind of statement, but with the erosion of the independent election of judges through the Judicial Services Commission, the colonization, if you will, by the executive of the National Prosecuting Authority, and the role of the police, where we see allegations that the Commissioner of Police is deliberately positioning to protect the executive rather than the people in more and more instances. And so the erosion of constitutionalism is an enormous threat to our democracy. And when we look back, we will see that at this period in our history, Thuli Madonsela and the public protector was an anomaly, and we need to strengthen all of the institutions of our democracy to hold power to account. Did we realize that quickly enough? That is the question we're going to be asking when we look back at this particular period. And Trevor Manuel has certainly spoken up about it. He said it is the big issue of this election, and I agree with him, and I think many people do. And that highlights the fact that people across the boundaries of all political parties believe that that is a critical issue. The third important issue that when we look back, we will say was the key question about this election is this: did we highlight the real policy issues enough? Did we put the real policy choices before the electorate? And those are, which party has the best policies to beat poverty, ensure economic and social inclusion, and redress the legacy of apartheid? Those are the key policy questions in this election. Issues like Nkandla are very helpful because they are good and powerful symbols of what the state has become. But the risk of those overwhelming issues in an election campaign is that they overshadow the policy debates. And while the DA always puts the policy debates right out there on the table, they're often washed away in the tsunami of various scandals at which Zuma is the center of all. And so we need always to come back to the policy issues, the policy questions, and the debates. I think Alistair Sparks rightly said in the newspapers yesterday that the DA has presented by far the most viable set of policy proposals for uplifting the poor that have been put before this country. And we must keep on doing this during this election campaign, because that is what it's about. This has always been our goal, and it is now more than ever before. And we can only do that by achieving rapid job-creating economic growth, which is the goal behind our 8% growth and jobs plan. And that plan has very strong overlaps with the National Development Plan. Interestingly enough, our 8% jobs and growth plan was completed before the National Development Plan was released. And we were very interested to see that a consultant to the South African Reserve Bank modeled policies almost identical to the DA's, which were then put up on the South African Reserve Bank's website, which said that indeed it is possible, given this kind of policy package, to achieve 8% growth, which will achieve 6 million sustainable jobs in a decade. And so our policy proposals have been tested and modeled, and they work. Then we have a whole package of redress measures that incentivize job creation, that incentivize training, that incentivize support and mentorship, not those that stifle investment and undermine job creation. We believe in a scorecard. We've got a very, very good alternative scorecard that does all of those things. We've got a packet that includes internships, a youth wage subsidy, support for small businesses, opportunity vouchers, and the good thing is that we're able to pioneer many of those where we govern, and they're beginning to introduce systemic and lasting and viable, sustainable change. We saw again in the newspapers today that Pali Lehohla made the point that the key driver of unemployment is the poor quality of public education in South Africa. And of course, our public education policies are tried and tested and bringing about systemic change where we govern in the Western Cape. We have what we call the 7 pillars, the 7 T's: good teachers, good time management, good textbooks for every child in every subject, testing against targets, training, and a good technology platform. And with that, we can systemically transform education, which we are in the process of doing. We also believe in increasing the National Student Financial Aid Scheme to 16 billion rand, which we've costed in our budget and is entirely affordable, and build in incentives for young people, especially young women, to finish school and to pursue tertiary education in one form or another, with a particular emphasis on further education and training colleges, which we think are underutilized and could be significantly expanded. We also have strong proposals for a safety net of social security that can help people get a foothold in the economy rather than remain permanently dependent on welfare. And that is the package that Alistair Sparks says is the best by far in promoting the possibility of the poor to escape poverty. One item that he particularly pulled out of there was the title deeds that we're proposing to give home ownership and real land reform in the urban economy, but there are many others as well. Which then brings us to the fourth critical issue that we will have to think about when we look back on this election, and it'll be this. Did the voters take their responsibility and use their power to call a power-abusing government to account? And we can do all we possibly can to put the issues before the voters. We can enter every debate possible, raise a lot of money and spend it on advertising, on events, on every other issue. But the question in the end is, did the voters take their responsibility to hold a power-abusing government to account? And the image that will always remain with me is the one on our oversight visit to Nkandla. You'll recall that the government was refusing to answer any questions about Nkandla in the National Parliament, and so we took a decision to walk to Nkandla to see for ourselves. We got all the permissions and we did what had to be done. And it was amazing for me to see it at first hand, the incredible opulence of it and the scale. And then to see people from a poverty-stricken surrounding community coming out and doing everything they could to prevent us proceeding along that road, because they were defending Jacob Zuma's palace surrounded by poverty. And equally, the police helping them to prevent us continuing on our road. And I saw the institutions of state and poverty-stricken people defending a person who has in fact used a democracy to turn himself into a paramount chief. And that really gave me the insight that unless people understand that their president serves them, not that they serve him and defend his abuse of power and corruption, unless the voters take that responsibility, we can't succeed in building a democracy. And this election, when we look back, will crucially also be about that. The DA is involved in its 5th round of court cases to try, for example, to find out why those 763 counts of corruption, fraud, and money laundering were withdrawn against Jacob Zuma just before the election. And if people, voters, are prepared not to know about that, and if they are prepared to allow political decisions rather than legal decisions to determine our criminal justice system, then they will have to take responsibility in the future. And so this election is critically about the responsibility of voters as well, and whether they will take it up. Many people often say that the guardians of democracy are the media and opposition, the institutions of the Constitution and civil society, and while all of those work, elections aren't that important. But I believe that to be a profound fallacy, because all of those can work, but unless voters in the final instance exercise their responsibility and put checks and balances on power by voting out a corrupt government, then none of the other checks and balances have lasting value, because if leaders know that they will never be voted out in any event, why should civil society protests or even a critical media make any difference to a corrupt government? And finally, and the last point I want to make, is that I'm now more optimistic about our democracy than I have ever been before. When we had our first election in 1994, that is 20 years ago, and certainly our democracy is a great, great thing to celebrate. When we had our first election and everyone was euphoric, I was quite depressed, because I felt that politics in South Africa was going to become a contestation of competing racial nationalisms, with a national party and the African National Congress forming the two opposing poles. In the event, what we have done is built a party that stands for the open opportunity society for all, based on those critical four principles: constitutionalism, an open market economy, non-racialism, and the separation of party and state. And I believe there's a very real possibility of that vision becoming the majority in a stable center of South African politics when we manage to achieve realignment. And the outcome of this election depends on the DA doing well enough to form a stable core of a possible coalition government in 2019, or even the stable core of a new merged entity that can govern South Africa according to the Constitution and Nelson Mandela's dream. Thank you very much.
Know more about your world.
eNCA.com